Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to look at how to UV unwrap organic forms. We've already looked at how to UV unwrap hard surfaces, and so this is something that would be considered like a soft surface, right? In this case, what we're looking at is a really quickly modeled snake. And the way that I modeled this, I'm just going to go to model view so we can see the screen more fully for a second. And I have no idea. Oh, right. So you can kind of see how I modeled this to some degree. So I started with a spline, a capsule, and the spline wrap. And so if I turn off the danger noodle object for a second so you can't see it, and turn these back on, you'll see that with the beginning of this, this is just a capsule. I basically created a spline, created a capsule, used the spline wrap to pull the capsule along the length of that spline, and I just created enough horizontal height subdivisions to make this smooth, and again with the caps as well. So if I look at the capsule, and I'm leaving this in the file so you can look at how to do this, at least this step of it. And so the radius, so there were 30 height segments and 10 cap segments to get this nice smooth end. I can't remember how many there were to start with. Maybe it was like 4 or something, right? But it looks significantly worse. And when I bumped that up to 10, I got a reasonably smooth kind of nematode. Ooh, I just changed the rotation segments, and now it looks like some sort of strange techno worm. But yeah, so I created 10 cap segments, and that allowed me to have a pretty smooth looking body, right? And it looks a little bit like a worm right now. Something else you can do with spline wrap, right, is with the offset, you can actually create a path to have something animate along as it slithers in or out of a scene. And so if you go forward to do the animation, the ArtIS 408, the animation course, you could potentially use this as a way to work. And you can actually make it stubbier and longer, so you could even have it contract and expand on itself. It's a worm. And then, the strength, right? You can make, have a flatworm or something in there. Anyway, so I made this setting, and then what I did is I basically made it editable, and I ended up deleting the polygons off one of these caps, and I created I closed this polygon hole, but I created a whole bunch of slices in it, so I had more geometry. So if I turn the snake back on, this is the end that I took off, and you'll notice it doesn't come to a point. It actually comes to some weird grid, and that's because I deleted things back, added a polygon, and then cut it several times so that I had more geometry to work with, right? A better way to have potentially done this would have been to have created a sphere, made sure that, or another capsule, honestly, would probably work too, and just made sure my, here, let me turn this one off. There we go. Right. And just deleted the end off this capsule that I had made editable, and then model the head separately so it's actually symmetrical on the x-axis, because I was doing this all freehand, which was a joy. And then weld these two pieces together. Right. So once I've modeled the snake body and the snake head, then I weld them together into one, or use the stitch and sew to sew them into one body. Right, which is a smarter way to model. But I was doing this very quickly, and I actually used the sculpt tools to model the head. I didn't turn on a sculpt tag. I didn't add any geometry. I just used those sculpt tools as a way to model this mesh. And then I used the inflate and the radial symmetry tool to inflate evenly along the body of this to make it have a little bit more weight and girth, and then thin it out a touch at the end of the tail as well, right? And so that's how I modeled this. And so now what we're going to do is we want to take this and we want to be able to unwrap this so that we can have some sort of sane way to either paint this or to add an image as a texture. And I don't remember if I have it in this version of the file or not, so I'm going to go to my standard mode to see if there's any materials. There's not. So one of the things that right, I found online is this really crappy texture that you could potentially use. And where is it? Here it is. There's this snakeskin.jpg file, and basically it is a image of a snakeskin that has been like skinned off a snake, and so it doesn't have the head, but it does have the body, right? And so part of this is, if I had an image, or if I actually wanted to draw and paint like the actual texture of a snake on this body, I'm going to need a way to get UVs that make sense. And if I try and do this with any of the standard things, because it's such a long body, cylindrical might potentially work, but with the head and everything, it's just a mess. And so we need to figure out how to do this. And the technique I'm going to show you, a couple different ways that you can do it, because it basically acts like an arm as well, the way that you cut an arm off a body. And we'll talk about that. So when you're modeling organic forms, and this often comes in if you're modeling a figure and then you want to be able to body paint or texture or apply other things to a figure, you need to figure out, how do I take that figure and unwrap it? And the best way to think about it is, how are your clothes made, right? If you have a jacket on or a long sleeve shirt on, where are the seams, right? There's a seam around your shoulder, and there's usually a seam on the underside of your arm or the back side of your arm, depending on the shirt. And then there's, depending on the shirt, sometimes there's seams down the sides of the shirt. Sometimes there's maybe a seam in the back, especially if it's a dress or something like that. And, my shirt, I'm wearing a button down. It has a seam in the front, but often that's not the case, right? T-shirts are a little different because they're super stretchy and they're made in a very specific way. But just always think about this as something that would need seams. And the same goes for pants, right? How are pants taken from being flat material and then formed to your body, right? And you don't usually have to go quite so crazy with it. You don't have to, do like every seam around the waist and the crotch and all of that. You really just need to be able to split it in a few pieces. And so we're going to look at how to do that with this snake body, because it's simpler and faster. Okay, so to start with, let's go ahead and grab our snake. Now, when this was made, if I go to my BP UV edit mode, you'll see that there are already UVs and seams. And this object, when I created it, automatically had UVs applied to it. And so, but in this case, we have no idea where that is, and that uniformity that we're seeing there and where this seam is could be very problematic. So if I select just one of these, you can see now where the seam is applied on the body of the snake. It's sort of haphazard, although it does illustrate some of the ways we're going to want to do this, right? We will want to be able to split this a little bit to fold things open a touch. But the seam here is all the way along the top surface of our snake. And that is really problematic, because what would happen is we'd go to paint this, and you'll see this when we start painting around seams, is that you get really messy edges. There's not a smooth transition from here to here on your grid. And so it becomes problematic. Now, seams are something that are always going to be there, and you have to work around them, and you have to choose where to put them and how to put them in the best places. And that's why seams are where seams are in clothes, right? They're where they're not noticeable. They're where they make the biggest difference. Or they can help improve the form. And so in our case, a snake, we wouldn't want the seam here. Most likely, we're not, the viewer, whoever's looking at this model, is probably not going to see a whole lot of the bottom of the snake. Now, if they are, then maybe you would want to change where your seams are for that specific scenario. But we're going to say the bottom of the snake is probably going to be on the ground. We're not really going to see it. Whereas the top of the snake is, in this composition, is what we're going to be looking at. So, first thing we need to do is deselect all these polygons, go over here, select our UV tag, and just hit delete. Right, we want to get rid of those old UVs entirely. And so now what we need to do is figure out how we want to model this. And there's two ways we could do this. We could either, go from, say, the underside of the jaw and just split all the way down the entire body of the snake, or we could do a loop selection here and actually cut the head off, split the body, and then have our freedom to unfold the head in whatever way we like. And so we're going to do the second option just because it shows us a little bit more technique in terms of how to do this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define our selection area. Now we know that we want to cut the head off. So let's go ahead and go to Edges mode. And then we're going to hit the letter U on the keyboard, followed by the letter L. Or we're going to select the Loop Selection tool from the Select menu, right, which is this very first one, U, L. All right, so I've got my loop selection. So what I want to do is you'll see that there is actually a edge selection on here already. We don't need that. So we're just going to go ahead and click right here where the head meets the body of the snake to create this selection. And then what we'd like to do is say, okay, well, I want to do a loop selection here, right? I want to be able to select all the way down the bottom side of the body of the snake, but I don't want this to wrap all the way around. And so there is this option with the loop selection to stop at selections. So if I check mark this, right, now that loop selection stops here, but if I was to rotate my view and still have this selected, you'd see that it's actually looping all the way around the tail and coming back up. And so we need to stop it down at the tail. So let's go ahead and come down to the tail. And let's go to the underside and let's say, this is probably the one that we want to select, but what we're going to do is we're just going to use our live selection tool for a second, and we're going to make sure that only select visible elements is on. We're going to shrink our radius down to like 5 instead of 50, so I can actually select one line. I'm going to hold down Shift and click. So now I've set the two ends of my selection area, and I might actually want to zoom in, because I also need to hold down Shift and select that edge right there, all the way down to the tip of the tail. Now, typically, UVs like this are problematic when they all come to a single point like this, but this is also the shape of the body of this object, and so we're going to need to just deal with that. So now that I've done that, let's go ahead and use our loop selection, so U and L again. And if I hold down Shift and click with this stop at selection selected, I should, now if I zoom out, have a line that connects all the way along the bottom of the snake. And if I rotate my view around, it does not continue around the top. Okay, so now there's a couple ways that I could go about unwrapping this, right? One option is to just go to UV Unwrap and click that and let it do its thing. The other option would be to try and use the peeler. If I select the peeler now, you'll see that I do get a green line, right? That is a really good sign, right? So if I go ahead and hit apply on this and say, where did all my UVs go? Oh, so my UVs are off to the side. They're hidden over here. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, right? And so now I see this, massive blob over here. And I'm going to undo one thing. I'm going to click my UV peeler again. Letter A, I don't know why. Oops. There we go. I've got the options here. So now I can hit apply on this again. The UV peeler, I wish it would stay up. So if you lose these options because you're making some change over here, sometimes you have to undo it and then you select it again and the tool options come up, you hit apply, and then you can make these adjustments. It's a little frustrating. I wish it worked a little bit better, but that's fine. So one of the things now is, well, how do we want to organize this? The first thing is you'll notice that all of these UVs here in the middle are pretty squished together, whereas these are more stretched out. One thing we can do that we haven't talked about yet is we can go to our view in the UV editor window, and we can go down to distortion. And when we look at distortion, what distortion does is it shows you what is stretched and what is squished. And in our case, where the blue is stretched and the red is squished, right? And so that means that we do need to make some adjustments to this. And so if I hit the letter, if I hit the UV peeler tool again, and say, why are you not letting me do what I want to do? If I undo that, there we go. Okay, now I can come back and adjust this uniformity, right? So if I pull this all the way uniform, you'll see it actually really stretches a lot of the body of this thing, right? But one of the things I know that I want to do is I want this V uniformity to be a little bit better. If I go too tight, right, it's going to be problematic. And part of this you'll see is that I do have, because there were 30 height subdivisions here, the UVs are tighter together in here and more spread apart here. And now what I can do is I can, right, see if adjusting this uniformity, if I pull it out, it's too much. And so I can really choose, you know, how do I want this shape to appear, right? And if I, you know, pull this up, right, does that, you know, there's a little bit of tug and pull, but it's pretty close. And I don't think I need to max or min these at all. Now, something I could do, and this really depends on the base image that I want to use, right? You can see that this isn't really, you know, tweaking or warping these things too much, right? I mean, maybe that's doing it, right? But they still look uniform, right? They still look uniform. I'm not getting any further distortion from adjusting those. All it's doing is determining whether or not I'm using this entire field or not. And so I'm going to select these. I'm going to use my live selection tool. And to double click, I'm actually going to use the letter E or the move tool to click and drag and actually move all my UVs over here manually. So right now, right, they are filling up the entire image. Now, the only reason that I would want to maybe not have them fill up the entire image like this is what I might want to do is if my image, my base image that I want to wrap around this is narrower, right? So in our case, we would potentially want to squeeze this closer. I'm not going to do that just because, but hold on a second. Let me pull this up. All right. Okay. So if we look at this snake skin, right, in this case, this thing is, you know, this base image is really, really narrow. And so, you know, we might want to have that be more, a bit skinnier in order to have this apply more cleanly. But if we were making our own texture to go on there, it might be nice to have the additional resolution to be able to fill in. And there's a couple other ways we can also check and see how well this is doing. And we'll do that in just a second once we get done unwrapping the head. Okay, so now we've got the body laid out. And one of the things we can do is we can go to UV packing. We could also do relax UV and just see if that does anything. And what it did was actually terrible. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to select all the polygons. I'm going to try that one more time. So now you can see that what that did was it actually did, right, bring this back down to a more reasonable size, right? And so it's up to you what you want to do. You know, you could experiment with it being super spread out like that. I know from just that, right, that source image that I want to use that this, right, this is, maybe I should close some of these windows. Let me close a couple of these. Oops. Right, but that this image is much more closely related to the size and scale that I'm going to want, right? So I've relaxed my UVs. You'll notice that there is a little distortion, but this is never going to be perfect. And honestly, this is very light distortion, right? This is a little bit red, and that's a little bit blue, right? And so we'll see some changes, but nothing too crazy. So let's go ahead and select all of these. And much like before, we can just drag this up out of the way. We could hide it if we want to, or we could just leave it out of the way. It's up to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and work with the head. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I deselect all my polygons. I'm going to go to Edges, and I'm actually going to deselect all those edges. And I'm going to go ahead, and you can see now there's this green line here because that's my seam, right? And so I should be able to just do a single cut, but just in case, be able to split this open in a different way. But what I'm going to do instead is I am going to go ahead and loop select this again, just in case, because usually you want to have all of your cuts selected at the same time when you unwrap, or strange things can happen. So now I need to find a place where I want to split it. Now, again, the bottom of the head is probably where I'm going to want that seam, because I'm going to be doing maybe some detailing on the top, and I don't want there to be weirdness that people could potentially see, or areas where I'm going to have to spend a ton of time making it incredibly clean. And so because of this shape is weird, and there's these strange looping patterns that happen, I'm not going to use the loop tool to make this cut. What I'm going to use is the path selection tool. And the path selection tool is the letter U. And then if you go down through all of this list, it's the letter M. Right? And what the path selection tool does, which we've talked about before, is allows me to just click and drag along an edge to make a selection. So, oops, I forgot to hold down Shift. So I'm going to hold down Shift, click and drag to make this selection. And then what I'm going to want is I want this to come to a point where I feel like it would split nicely. And where, say if I'm drawing a mouth on the snake, I'd want it kind of to be below that jawline. And honestly, this is a pretty good spot. It's not perfectly centered in the center of the face, and that's because the way I modeled this was not ideal. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to make a little bit of a cut here to make this T shape. Now, that's something that's very commonly done. If you look at how people unwrap, say, a human head, it's kind of gross, but it's almost Halloween, so why not, right? You can imagine them to take the skin off a human head, right? You can imagine them making an incision all the way along, say, the base of the neck, or maybe the base of the jaw, where the head meets the neck. And then if you want to hide on a human head any sort of seam, you're probably going to hide that under the hair. And so then you would make a vertical incision up through to the top of the head, and then somewhere behind the front edge of the hairline or near the front edge of the hairline, you would make a horizontal cut, not all the way down to the temples, but most of the way across. And then you can imagine, in the horrifying detail, I'm sure, that being unpeeled, right? And so it's a similar thing with the snake head. That horizontal cut, under here is going to allow all of that skin to fold out more flat with less distortion, right? So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to leave it just with this little T. I don't think I need it to be any larger. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, and we've got that cut made. So let's go ahead and go to our to our polygon selection. And really, I just want to select all the polygons on the head. So I'm going to go to my rectangle selection tool. I'm going to make sure only select visible elements is unchecked. I'm going to click and drag. And that's weird that it didn't select all of those, but whatever. It didn't select any extras, so that's good. So then I'll just use my live selection tool to pick up that last set by holding down Shift, clicking and dragging. Okay, so I've got all of those polygons selected. And I'm going to go ahead, and I've got my edges selected. I'm going to go ahead and hit UV Unwrap. And that looks problematic, so I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back to my edges. And I'm going to try this again, and if this doesn't work, I'll tell you what's going wrong. Okay, so I went to UV Unwrap, and I have successfully unwrapped the head. Now you'll see that there is a fair amount of distortion, and part of the question is, where is all of this distortion happening? So if I go to my polygons mode, and I select here, right, there's a lot of squishing happening on the face, and a lot of stretching happening right around the edges. Now, this is something that is going to happen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and double click on all of this. I might go ahead and attempt to relax these UVs just a little bit with one of these algorithms and see if that softens that any. It didn't really do much. And so what that means is I probably need to make an additional cut. And so you can see where this T is, right, where I've got those edges cut there. And so let's see what happens if I either extend that cut a little bit. I don't think I'm going to get a whole lot more out of that, but let's go ahead and see what we get. So I'm going to go back to my edges mode. I'm going to rotate around the bottom. And let's see if I just split this out a little bit further, if that helps. So if I hold down Shift and Shift just to get two more seams on there, and I go to Relax UV, but I check mark the cut selected edges and hit Apply, right? That splits things out a little bit more. It's giving me a little bit less distortion there, right? And it's a little bit lighter on these edges as well. You can see that that's still, pretty intense. So I'm going to change to LSCM. I'm going to press on that. And that actually evens this out a little bit, right? This geometry is a mess, by the way. So there's only so much we're going to do, right? But it's gotten a little bit better. Now, oops, I did not mean to select those polygons, or those edges. And so, there isn't a whole lot more we can do. Something we could, I could have potentially maybe gone a little bit further forward with this cut to see if that helped a little bit. So maybe what I'll do is I'll deselect, maybe what I'll do is I'll undo a couple of these last things. Let's see if I can undo all the way to that unwrap. Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so this one's up here. All right, so then let's go ahead and hold down Control and get rid of these two. And this is just an experiment just to see what happens if we go up a little bit further, if we get a little less distortion on this face. And the trick, right, is that, this geometry isn't really the best, right? I could have done a much better job, but I'm going to go ahead and go up two more, and I'm just going to see what that happens. So I'm going to go ahead and click on UV Unwrap. If I come down here, even with that additional thing, it's a little bit less intense, but it's still there. So maybe I'll do one more selection, and the question is, which way do I want to do? I probably want to zag since I zigged before. So let's try that and just see. That's a little bit more even. It's still not quite great. Maybe if I apply this LSCM, you can see it changed things a little bit. If I apply it a couple more times, not a whole lot's happening. If I change this to ABF, let's see if that helps me some. Now it just basically pops it right back to where it was. If I click Unwrap a couple more times, sometimes that brings up a little bit of something, but I don't see a whole lot. It looks like I also have, I think that's the tip of the tail that I somehow totally missed, but that's all right. We don't really need it. That little tiny UV island. Right. So, no matter what I do, I'm going to have some distortion. And there's not, a whole lot more I can do with this. Again, I could go ahead and try and split this out a little bit. Let me go ahead and undo a few of those things I've done and undo this last. There we go. And maybe what I need to do now is just, split this up here like this and just see what happens with that. Maybe that will soften everything out a little bit. And it did a little. It's a little bit more even. There's still distortion. So if I go ahead and change to LSCM and hit apply, now there's more squishing, but there's a lot more evenness across that. And this one is being stretched a fair amount. And so, the question is, what am I okay with and what am I not okay with? In this case, I'm okay with all of this. And so what I'm going to do is I want to UV pack this. And in the last times, we were always saying preserve orientation. This time I don't really care. So I'm going to uncheck preserve orientation. I'm even going to uncheck equalize island size. I'm just going to hit apply. And I just want to see what that does. Interesting. I expected it to make this much larger and fill up more of the body. So let's go ahead and check mark equalize island size and let's see what happens. Absolutely nothing. So there was like a minor adjustment, but let's go ahead and do this ourselves then. So one of the things we can do is, if we want to see what this is going to look like, by the way, we can go to this UV map here, and then we can see where we have distortions, where things look even. And you can see, right, one of the things that's going on right now is this texture is twisting all the way around the body of the snake, and that's because this is not oriented with the grid. And so we have to make a choice which way we want it oriented and what scale we want it at. I'm going to say we want it larger and vertical. So let's go ahead and use our live selection tool, double click twice to select this island. We're going to grab our thing and we're just going to rotate this until it's more or less straight. And you'll notice that because, right, suddenly these rings are lining up with the subdivisions there. And we've got this nice straight line. And so we want to make sure that this snakeskin is fully on this texture. And so I'm going to go ahead and actually scale this just a hair down. All right, so now I've got, this looks a lot cleaner already. And then I just need to decide what I want to do. I mean, I'm not concerned about that tiny little island. Nobody is ever going to see that. So I'm going to double click on this island and pull this down somewhere a little bit closer. And I just have to see which orientation do I want. And honestly, you can see in that view, if I hover this over here like this, I actually get a pretty clean, right? It's not perfect because these polygons are not straight. And if that is a problem, then what I'm going to need to do is come in here and make some manual adjustments. And so what I can do is I can zoom way in and I can actually use this grid as a way to line up this bottom edge, right? And so if I really need these things to be straight, I can go to points mode and I can actually click on each of these little each of these points, and I can pull these up and I can try and reduce some of that distortion just by making them somewhat even. Now, obviously this whole side is off. And if I was to make a lot of adjustments here, you'll see that I'm going to get some changes, but that might actually be useful. So, right, if I want to get into this, I can come in here and, right, click on all of these points and just, right, snug them all down so I get a nice even scene here. Now when I'm doing that, there's a good chance that I'm creating more distortion elsewhere, but honestly this this mesh is pretty distorted as it is, right? So there's another tool we can use to do this, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Right, so I've started doing these. It's helped a little bit. If I rotate my view, I want to make sure that the head of the snake, at least the top of it, seems pretty uniform, and it's there. It's really close. There's a little bit of distortion here still, and I just need to figure out where that little bit is. Is it here? If I move this guy over a touch, what happens? That's the wrong direction. If I pull this over here, there we go. Oddly, pulling it that direction makes it a little bit snug up a little bit nicer, and that just means that, right, these other sides are going to be a little distorted. Now, you can see that they change color as I do this, and you can see all of these are more tightly fit, but that's also the shape they are on the head. And so, the question is, do I want these spread out a bit more so they match this other side? If I want to move things around in mass, which can get really messy, I want to use this magnet UV tool. And what that does is, if I say select all my points and start migrating this around, right, it'll move the entire thing. But if I create smaller selections, like let's say I use the live selection tool and I just, select some points in here and then use the magnet tool, it has a few different ways it works. Right now, right, I can actually decrease some of that compression there by doing this, but I can also adjust some of these settings. So I can make my radius much larger, so I could say like 80%. And what this is going to do is it actually, if I get close enough to some other points that I don't have selected, it should adjust them as well. I don't know why that's not happening. But if I go back to my other point, right, I can go ahead, and the big thing is that, I could continue to move these points around. Now, given that this is a tutorial and that this line is pretty straight, and I've got, it looks pretty clean on top, I'm actually really happy with where it is right now, right? There is some more significant distortion under here, but again, we're going to try and make that not so visible. And honestly, if I was to actually do this, and use this in something, I would redo the snake head entirely, and I would make sure that geometry is very even and uniform to allow me to split it more easily. But c'est la vie. Okay, so we've got these things wrapped. So this is kind of the basics of how you unwrap organic forms. You have to make the choice of where the seam should be. And so a snake is a really easy option. Let's look at something that is more frequently used and isn't necessarily more challenging, but it is kind of let's go ahead and let's do another example. Let's go ahead and save what we've got. And actually, I can just save this as it is. Replace it. Okay. And what we'll do is we're going to use this as an example when we go to body paint here in a little bit.